Welcome back to Debtonation. In episode 1 of Debtonation, we learned that Canada's economy is more indebted than were many of the countries that suffered the worst debt crises of the last century, and how those crises caused massive human suffering. We learned the 4 indicators of a forthcoming debt crisis. 1. Sustained debt buildup, especially household debt. 2. Asset price inflation. 3. Falling output. And 4. Large current account deficits. Have these things happened in Canada? This is Debtonation, Episode 2, Large Debt Buildups. Let's start with the facts. The total debt owed by all Canadians today is $10.2 trillion. The question is that a lot? Debt is to an economy what a big backpack is to a man walking up a hill. It might be hard for a 100-pound man to carry his own weight on his back. Now, imagine him carrying 350 pounds, or 3.5 times his body weight. He can barely move, and it won't be long before he collapses. That is like Canada's $2.86 trillion economy carrying around its $10.2 trillion debt.
Sorry? The servicing costs on the debt that you're going to have to carry, that you're adding to now, right?
Interest rates are at historic lows, Glenn.
Okay, but it's still a lot of money.
No.
It's still a lot of money.
No.
Our debt is 3.5 times our economy. All debt crises have involved debt that in one fashion or another have become dangerously out of scale in relation to the underlying means of payment, said John Kenneth Galbraith. A nation is like a family, which must make all its debt payment out of its income. If a family's debt keeps increasing relative to its income, eventually the family will not be able to afford to make its monthly payments. A country's gross domestic product is the total value of all the goods and services produced by that country. Like a family's income, it is the country's means of making payments to service its debt. So, has Canada's GDP kept up with its debt? No. From the start of 2015 to the middle of 2023, Canada's total public and private debt has grown from $7.9 trillion to $10.2 trillion, an increase of 28.5%, while the real GDP grew 14.1%. That means more than a quarter of all the current debt appeared in the last 8 years alone. But in that time, the GDP only grew half as fast. In other words, our debts are growing twice as fast as the incomes with which we pay those debts. When you look beyond just government debt, the problem is even worse. Total consumer, corporate, and government debt is 357% of our nation's GDP, basically the highest in 60 years, and more than 50% higher than the long-term average of 223%. How does that compare to the bubbles that led to major debt crises throughout history? Let's look around the world. In the immediate lead up to the Great Depression, total public and private debt was 125% of GDP in the United States. Remember the Greek debt crisis over a decade ago? Its economy burst after a debt bubble of 206% of GDP. Remember the subprime mortgage housing bubble in the United States that led to the massive 2008 financial crisis?
Easy credit, combined with the faulty assumption that home values would continue to rise, led to excesses and bad decisions. Many borrowers took out loans larger than they could afford, assuming that they could sell or refinance their homes at a higher price later on. The market is not functioning properly, and major sectors of America's financial system are at risk of shutting down.
That was 349% of GDP. Each of these debt bubbles led to massive economic crisis. The Great Depression ravaged the world for a decade. Stockbrokers jumped out of their office windows. People lined up on the street for food and lived in shantytowns called Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover. The Greek debt crisis led to pension cuts and a quarter of the entire workforce becoming unemployed.
Overseas now to Greece, a country on the brink of collapse.
All week, the banks closed, life savings locked up inside, with withdrawals limited to just $67. Heartbreaking scenes. like this retired man collapsing in tears after failing to get his wife's pension.
The United States subprime mortgage crisis caused millions of people to lose their homes. Yet, each of these bubbles had lower debt to GDP ratios than Canada has now. These are the debt ratios just before the bubbles burst in the 48 most significant financial crises of the last century. Canada currently has a bigger debt ratio than all but 3 of them. In most of these crises, countries detonated when their debts were less than 300% of GDP. Canada's present debt ratio is higher than that right now. So what makes us immune from the same fate? Are we special? We may think we are, but we can be sure that every one of those other countries thought they were special too, until they weren't. So who owes all the money? Well, it is divided about evenly between business, government, and households. Let's start with government debt. In 2022, Statistics Canada reported that the gross debt for governments in Canada reached 102% of GDP. A commonly repeated falsehood is that Canada has the lowest debt to GDP in the G7. The International Monetary Fund's October 2023 fiscal monitor shows Canada's general government gross debt is 106% of GDP, higher than Germany and the United Kingdom, and virtually tied with France, all G7 countries. It is true that Canada has the lowest net debt to GDP ratio, a measure that deducts with the prodigious assets of the Canada Pension Plan, the Quebec Pension Plan, and other government assets from the overall debt, without counting the pension liabilities for future retirees. By counting these pension plans against the debts, governments seem to be implying that they could use these funds to bail themselves out of a debt crisis. But pensioners would, rightly, fight such a raid and force politicians to back off. As such, gross debt is a better future measure. Worse still, reporting of the federal government's debt omits hundreds of billions of dollars of loans guaranteed by the government, which would become outright debt in the event of default. As an example, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation guarantees about $898 billion in mortgage debt, much of which would fall on the backs of federal taxpayers if the housing bubble bursts. How did we get here? I know, you're going to say COVID. COVID has become the dog ate my homework excuse for all government failures. But blaming the Trudeau government's debt addiction on COVID is not accurate.
Sorry?
First, the Trudeau government has run bigger than promised deficits in every year it has been in office, and it abandoned its promises to balance the budget by 2019, cap deficits at $10 billion, and continually reduce the debt to GDP ratio. It is worth repeating, the Liberal government let all of these fiscal anchors go before COVID-19. Other levels of government were just as irresponsible. The Liberal McGuinty-Wynne government doubled Ontario's public debt between 2003 and 2014, long before COVID, even though only a few of those yearly deficits were justified by the 2008-9 global recession. Even during the COVID crisis, much of the Trudeau government's spending had nothing to do with the crisis and therefore cannot be blamed on COVID alone. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has concluded that 35.5% of the new spending the government added during COVID had nothing to do with COVID. Still, debts exploded during that time with a deficit of $328 billion in the year 2020-21, equal to 14.8% of Canada's GDP, the largest deficit ratio outside of World War II. Again, blaming COVID for the whole thing ignores that it was hardly the first crisis in history. The federal government's deficit as a percentage of GDP peaked at 9% in World War I, 6% in the Great Depression, and 4% in the Great Global Financial Crisis of 2008-09. In other words, the federal deficit in 2021, adjusted for inflation and the size of the economy, was 64% bigger than it was in World War I. 2.5 times what it was during the Great Depression, and almost 4 times bigger than it was during the Great Global Financial Crisis. Only during the Second World War was the deficit bigger? In the years afterwards, the federal government, in the 40s, repaid this debt, running a record 5% of GDP surplus in 1947, just 2 years after the war ended, and the size of the economy almost tripled in real terms in the quarter century that followed. This staggering growth vaporized Canada